South Louisiana, filled with both wildlife and beauty, has become a mecca of tourism, due in part to a group of people known as the Cajuns, many of whom are direct descendants of Acadians. But what is the connection between Cajuns and Acadians? What events caused these people to experience tremendous hardships, persecution, and sacrifice? To gain a better perspective on the culture, we must look to the past and view the experiences that made the culture what it is today. By examining the past, we can gain a full appreciation of the customs that are fading and the tremendous loss that will occur if steps are not taken to protect this incredible American treasure.
The Acadians were originally French people that migrated from France over to Nova Scotia. But what part of France did they actually live in? What did they do in France prior to leaving? And what would cause them to leave a land that was so beautiful and travel across the ocean to a land that was raw and untamed?
They came from a very concentrated area in the eastern part of France. The largest city that they were grouped around was Poitou in eastern France, close to the Atlantic Ocean. And probably 95% of these early Acadians, they were French at the time, were farmers. They lived in small villages, they worked on farms. They were very much small farmers like we find today in Louisiana. So the roots of their origins in eastern France very much reflect the type of life that they led when they went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and then later were transported to Louisiana and other places. So that long agricultural rural tradition has been with the Acadians since they left France.
That the Acadian population that moved from France to Nova Scotia were somewhat diverse, but most of them came from a place that's called today La Vendée, which is an old province called Poitou in France. And most of them were engaged in as farmers in a feudal system that existed in France at that time. In other words, they worked and farmed for the property that belonged to a lord or someone that was a big property owner over there.
I draw a distinction between the Cajuns and the Acadians. I refer to the Cajuns' distant ancestors as the Acadians, and they came from southwestern France in the area around Poitou. And there were several reasons why they wanted to leave France to come to the New World. There had been a lot of religious violence between Catholics and Protestants in that part of France. There had been famine, there had been disease. They were living on the estates of nobility who levied high taxes on them.
The phenomenon, people always ask why did the French leave the area, and why would they go to what was basically one of the first settlements in Canada, was in Nova Scotia. And the main reason was actually religious unrest. This was the time in the 17th century where there were a lot of conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. The Acadians themselves were very Catholic in nature, or the French in that region, and they were under a lot of pressure in eastern France to lend adherence either to the Protestants or to the Catholics, and they got to the point where they just felt it was disrupting their lifestyle to a level where they decided to ship off to the New World and be able to develop the kind of culture and religious lifestyle and family lifestyle that they wanted to maintain.
Religious turmoil was very important in the decision to go to the New World, because in that area of Poitou, they had long been, since the latter part of the 16th century and into the 17th century, horrendous chaos and turmoil between Protestant people who mainly were protesting against the church as it was administered from Paris, and they were horrendous. There were massacres that took place. There were burning at the stake of witches and all kinds of things during that time. So I'm certain that was one of the issues that they were trying to escape.
Although the French people in the area of Poitou were persecuted for their religious beliefs, and this was certainly the main reason that they left the area, there were other factors that caused them to consider moving to a different region and starting a new life.
Another reason is that there was an offer of free land to people who were going to the New World, and that enticed many of these Frenchmen to go to the New World, because they equated having their own land with freedom. So they left France, that southwest region of France, and went to the New World, and they would work for X number of years. I think it's five years for the company, trapping furs. And at the end of that 5 years, they were free to work for themselves entirely.
They say that the codfish were so numerous that you could practically walk on the water. They had that many fish there. So that had been a draw to people from Northern Europe for a long time. So some of them came and engaged in fishing industry early on. Another thing that happened during the colonial period, and it was part of the mercantile system, had to do with trapping. And so there were some trappers there who tried to make a living in that capacity. What's interesting about the Acadians in Nova Scotia between the early 1600s and into the 1700s was that they did develop an agriculture base there to their lifestyle, and in order to do that, they had to drain some land that was periodically flooded by the Bay of Fundy. And so the Bay of Fundy had such a great tidal range that when the tide would come in, it would push far into the inlets and flood a lot of land. But by building dikes, they were able to keep the flooded tide water out, and eventually the rainwater would desalinate or freshen up the land that used to be covered by salt water. And all of that became prime farmland. And the Acadians had to, of course, build and maintain those dikes. And that's one of the things that the Acadians are best known for, is to develop an agricultural economy that captured land from the sea.
When they first arrived, they discovered that they had to adapt their own agricultural style to a new region that was very different. It was oceanfront, a different climate. They had to reclaim land in order to plant, and so they built a tremendous system of dikes and channels in order to sort of bring the land back. Very, very similar to the type of land we have in South Louisiana, strangely enough. There are a lot of parallels, but they were also very isolated and were left alone by both the French and the British, who at different times controlled that part of Canada. And so they were able to continue their strong family ties, their agricultural ties. They enhanced that with fishing and seafood and trapping. They learned from the Native Americans in the area, and as long as they were left alone, they were very contented. What happened, though, was that about the beginning of the 18th century, around 1700, the British took over finally, after the 30 Years' War, and took over the control of the area. And they were very nervous about the Acadians at that time because, number one, they were Catholic, and the Anglican Church was really strong, and the British wanted the Acadians to change their religion. Same thing that had caused them to leave France in the first place. The other thing was that they considered themselves still French, and they were asked to swear an oath to the King of England, something that they refused to do.
England demanded that the Acadians, who wanted to be neutral, but they demanded that the Acadians would not fight against England, and that they would change religion too, because in those days religion and politics were not too far different. So if you support the Catholic Church, you would be supporting France, and England, of course, was not Catholic. So that was one of the issues. But that's one of the issues. And of course, you know, it's told, you know, that the refusal to swear allegiance to the Crown of England is what caused the exile. And that, indeed, that was one of the events and one of the factors. But of course, there was a war, a huge war brewing at that very time, and it broke out about that time. We call it the French and Indian War. So from England's point of view, they wanted to get rid of that population, because had they joined with the French people in Quebec, they would have been difficult to defeat. As it was, they were still difficult to defeat, but they did defeat the French. It was easier after exiling the Acadians.
A plan was devised to gather up all of the Acadians at that time and bring them into a church. Still very religious. They brought all the men into a church. They locked them in. They took the wives and children and separated them, and then they announced that they were going to deport them. This is what we call le grand dérangement, you know, the big upheaval. And the plan was to take these Acadians, who were reluctant to follow the British rule, and to disperse them throughout the British colonies in North America. So we know that many of them ended up coming to Louisiana, but a good number of them were also dropped off in the colonies along the eastern seaboard, places like Maryland, Connecticut, Virginia. Some of them were even transported back to France, but they all left on boats. And then a number of them actually came to Louisiana.
Of the 15,000 to 18,000 Acadians who lived in pre-expulsion Nova Scotia, about half of them died during the expulsion due to starvation, disease, exposure, and even violence at the hands of the British. And when they settled in South Louisiana, they encountered other peoples who were already here or who would come here later. For example, there were a lot of Frenchmen who had come to Louisiana directly from France, who were already here when the Acadians arrived. There were Spaniards here. There were a lot of Germans. The Spaniards who founded New Iberia would get here after a lot of the Acadians were already here. They came here in 1779, though the Acadians had already been here a few years by then.
By the 1750s, there was enough cattle in that area to start that trade. So that's still well before the Acadians arrived. There were some people like Andre Moss who operated from Lauraville to Saint Martinville, and then on the other side, eventually on the other side of the bayou, west of the Bayou Teche as well. And we see cattle brands, for example, that go back to the 1730s. So they had those kind of things going prior to the Acadian arrival.
Eventually, about 3,000 Acadians made their way to Louisiana, beginning in 1764-65, and settled not too far away from where we are now in New Iberia. They settled around Foss Point, and then spread out from there throughout South Louisiana.
There were 200 and some odd Acadians in the first group that came to the Poste des Tacapau. That was in St. Martinville, around St. Martinville. But actually, it was in Lauraville where they first arrived there.
A number of them actually came to Louisiana, which at that time was under Spanish rule. The French had passed it on to the Spanish, and during that 100 years, the Spanish were very happy to have the Acadians, because the Acadians had two qualities that they were looking for. They wanted to be farmers, so they didn't want to stay in New Orleans or any of the cities in the colonies. They were passive, they were hardworking, and so they were given land grants, and the idea was from down around Morgan City up through Opelousas, grants were given along bayous for farmers and Acadians to settle. They thought that they could use them then as a buffer between peoples in Texas, what was still Mexico at the time, and Louisiana.
The Acadians lived side by side with these other peoples, but didn't really intermarry with them on a large scale until the end of the Civil War. And this is actually Carl Brazzo's research that I'm citing from his book Acadian to Cajun, A Transformation of a People, whose very title tells you that the Cajuns and the Acadians were not quite the same people. The Acadians, as Brazzo points out, began to intermarry on a large scale with other ethnic groups right after the Civil War. And the reason for this is that these other ethnic groups, the Spanish, the French, the Germans, and others, had held themselves apart from the Acadians and looked down on them, because the Acadians had always been subsistence farmers. They grew just enough to survive. These other peoples, acquired material wealth to live more comfortably. They were upwardly mobile. But after the Civil War, the economy in the South was ruined. The economy in French Louisiana, the southern part of Louisiana, was also ruined. The Acadians and these newly impoverished ethnic groups that had previously looked down on them were now, after the Civil War, working together side by side in the fields as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and that made it acceptable, once they were all equally poor, to intermarry with the Acadians for the first time. So you had a lot of Acadians marrying non-Acadians on a widespread basis for the first time. Over 50% of the marriages that Carl Brazzo looked at in the census data and elsewhere, church records, over 50% of the time, young Acadian men and Acadian women were marrying non-Acadian men and women. So you had Boudreaux and Thibodeaux and Thériaults marrying Abshires and Hulins and Emails, who were all Germans. They were marrying Romeros and Miguezes and D'Artezes, who were all Spanish. They were marrying Fontenauds and Swallows, who were French Creoles. And that's why today all of these distinctly non-Acadian surnames like that are considered Cajun nevertheless. Because Cajuns, by their very nature, are a mixture of ethnic groups. Acadian, French Creole, Spanish, German, and other ethnic groups.
After the Civil War, there became a creeping, what we call an Americanization. And Acadians and Cajuns were resistant to that. In fact, as little as 20 years ago, I would talk to a Cajun in French, and I would ask them what they were and who they were, and they would not say they were American. They'd say, "Je suis pas américain, je suis Cajun." That is, they identified themselves as Cajuns and not really as American, because they were resistant to this sort of Americanization of their culture. Partly because it was Protestant, partly because it was another language, partly because it brought in a lot of new technologies and industries that they were not comfortable with. And so there was a sort of passive resistance, I should say. But then three things happened in the 20th century that really changed Cajun culture forever. The first was the imposition of English as the language of the schools, which happened around 1920. And in 1920, you could no longer speak French at school. In fact, it was disallowed and you would be punished. And several Cajun poets have written about this. A famous poet, Jean Arsenault, wrote something called "You cannot speak French on the playground. You cannot speak French on the playground." And this really sort of stigmatized and caused a very negative reaction by Cajuns to their own language. They had not learned how to read and write French. They had just spoken it. It was strictly a spoken language. And here, English was presented through the schools as the future, as the literate language, as the superior language. And so a whole cultural complex developed amongst Cajuns where what they spoke, what they say, "Je parle le mauvais français." I speak bad French. And this really stuck with them. They didn't want to pass it on to their children because they wanted their children to be successful. And so French became sort of a hidden language that the older people would speak to themselves so their children wouldn't understand what they were talking about. And they hid it away in everything that they did. So this was a tremendous impact on the culture and language.
When I was a kid, I learned how to speak French because my grandfather lived with us. But during those days when you spoke French, or if you spoke French, when you spoke English, you had what we call a Cajun accent. And because of that, people kind of looked down on you. When in my freshman year in college, I took a speech course. The professor's name was Dr. Doherty. Never forget Dr. Doherty. Now the course had nothing to do with pronunciation. It had to do with how to give a speech. But at the end of the semester, he pulled me aside and he said,